Obviously, right now in the NBA, we're talking about trades that could happen, but what about a trade that has already happened? Let's do kind of a check-in and update video on the Knicks trading for OG Anunoby and the Raptors getting Immanuel Quickley and RJ Barrett in exchange, because this is a deal that I found incredibly interesting at the time. It's two teams that are going in different directions. It was the start of the Raptors really breaking things down there in Toronto. Of course, now they've also traded away Pascal Siakam, and there have been some really interesting takeaways for both of these teams, and honestly, a lot of it has been positive. Now, I want to start this by talking about the Knicks, because I was a little bit more skeptical about their part in this trade. Just from a value standpoint, I felt like RJ Barrett was still someone that was an asset around the league, someone that could still grow into something, and Immanuel Quickley is one of the better bench guards in the entire league, and that was a role that was going to be difficult for the Knicks to replace, and they gave up like a second round pick or something, but basically I felt like New York added a nice piece in OG Anunoby, but maybe gave up some of their contracts and their assets that could have been used on like a bigger name player, someone that maybe could be even more impactful than OG Anunoby. And really, that was my criticism of the deal at the time. It wasn't necessarily about OG as a player. It was more about what's the long-term goal for New York, and is trading away these two guys going to limit their ability to add another player, because it was clear at the time that even adding OG Anunoby does not make this team a championship contender. And I still don't think that they are championship contenders, even as good as Brunson is, and Randall has been playing well. OG has been really good, which we're going to talk about throughout the video. I still don't think they're on championship contender level, but here's the bottom line about OG Anunoby, and I talked about this on other channels as well. There's a list of a handful of guys around the league that on one night can realistically guard Jason Tatum, and on a different night can realistically guard someone like Anthony Edwards. And OG Anunoby is on that list. It's a very, very short list. Players that have that kind of defensive ability and versatility. And I think I maybe undersold that a little bit in my initial video talking about the trade and how impactful that was going to be for New York, because they don't have, nobody really has that kind of player on their roster. Like I said, there's only a handful of guys like that, but the Knicks specifically, all of their wings and guards and stuff were either one-way players and can only guard or can only shoot, or some of their better defensive players were kind of smaller guys. They didn't have this 6'8", 6'9" wing that can shoot and defend and is kind of a connecting piece offensively. They didn't have that. And the impact of OG Anunoby on the Knicks has not only been him as a player and all the things that he provides, but also in replacement of the other guys that were fulfilling those roles before, as well as kind of the different lineups they can use where they can play a little bit bigger, a little bit smaller, moving around Randall as well. And this isn't even like the best version of what the Knicks could look like defensively, because Mitchell Robinson is out for the year, or I guess almost out for the year. And so there's still kind of another step to this. And I definitely think that we have now seen how much of an impact OG Anunoby can truly have in New York. It hasn't been, some crazy offensive explosion. And part of the reason he maybe wanted to go somewhere other than Toronto was to have a little bit more of an offensive role, which is something that we're going to have to kind of keep an eye on over the next couple of seasons in New York, assuming that he re-signs this offseason. But his impact on the defensive end of the floor has been incredible for them. His plus minus is out of control for the Knicks. And he's not even necessarily making a huge splash offensively. It's just where he fits in the roster, as well as how good he is defensively, has been unbelievable for the Knicks. And it's absolutely been a win for them. They are still, actively exploring ways to replace the Immanuel Quickley aspect of this. That's been rumored and reported for a while. And as of this recording, they haven't made a move to replace that spot. They need a bench guard, another creator, with RJ and Immanuel Quickley both gone. But bottom line is OG Anunoby has been awesome. But speaking of Quickley and Barrett, I want to talk about this for Toronto as well, because I think there's been a lot of attention on how good OG has been in New York, but there also should be more conversation about RJ Barrett and Immanuel Quickley in Toronto, especially now that Pascal Siakam is gone as well, because you can look at those two guys plus Scotty Barnes as kind of the core moving forward for Toronto. And it's a really interesting group, because RJ has been more involved offensively in terms of like on-ball creation stuff, and also is like a secondary playmaker in terms of cutting off the ball and things like that. It's clear that he's going to have more offensive responsibility there in Toronto than he did in New York, and there's a confidence level with him that is starting to rise. Now, we've been here before with RJ Barrett thinking he's going to be something, then he ends up not being that thing, and we've kind of gone back and forth on this, so it's definitely still going to be kind of like a long-term thing. But for him as a player, I really like the fit in Toronto, because they're not good and they're just going to kind of let him spread his wings a little bit, right? I mean, they do the same thing with Scotty Barnes, where he gets put in positions to create and play make. And I think they're going to do the same with RJ. And as a piece that you could potentially build upon, that's a really, really nice thing to get in exchange for OG Anunoby, because if it wasn't going to be that, then they would have gotten some draft picks. But I mean, if you're picking in the 20s, there's no guarantee you're going to get someone with a potential upside of someone like RJ Barrett. And basically, I'm just happy for him, because it feels like a really good opportunity for him. And same Same thing with Immanuel Quickley. His long-term future is still probably as a really, really good six-man guard that can guard and create and can shoot. He's just not consistent enough on a night-to-night basis to be the starting point guard for 80 games and just be a really good, you know, facilitator and all that stuff. He's still a little bit more up and down than you'd like him to be. But for a Toronto team that was relying on like Dennis Schroeder as a guard, who's been good this year, but nothing crazy good, it's nice to have that other option. And again, a player that will continue to grow and develop. And maybe more importantly for Toronto, each of those guys are still going to be an asset in a year, in 2 years, in 3 years, assuming that Quickley signs a new contract. And that is almost as impactful to them as it is what they actually do on the floor, because it's clear that over the next couple of seasons, it is unlikely that Toronto is going to be any good. And if at some point they need to make a move to kind of push things a little bit further along, RJ Barrett and Immanuel Quickley are both certainly going to be assets for them down the road. And this is just a really cool trade. We talk about trades on this channel all the time, and not often do we get to talk about two actual like win-win moves for each of these teams. Now, obviously, we have no idea what this is actually going to look like a year, 2 years, 3 years from now. Of course, New York still has to figure out an extension with OG Anunoby, which is a huge piece of this. But for just the few weeks that we've seen each of these new pieces on the floor for their new teams, it feels like a move that has certainly worked out all around. And really, moving forward for Toronto, it is all about the development of those two guys and how they continue to get the pieces to fit. And for the Knicks, as it has always been, it's about that next piece, right? They got OG Anunoby. Now what's the final piece of the puzzle? Because I think if you have Brunson, OG, and Randall, and then you add another guy to that to potentially move out Randall and upgrade that position, then you're starting to look at a team in New York that could possibly be, you know, conference finals or finals contenders. They're not there right now. The top of the East is absolutely loaded, and it would be incredibly difficult for them to make the conference finals or the finals this year without another move, but they are definitely in position with some future draft assets and some contracts on that roster to be able to make some kind of move, even in season if they wanted to, or more than likely in the offseason. And the OG Anunoby trade certainly helps them do that from a basketball perspective. My concern with the deal at the time was more so from an asset perspective with RJ Barrett and Immanuel Quickley, and of course having to replace Quickley, because I don't think people realize as they should have how good he is and how impactful he was for the Knicks. So they're still trying to replace that spot. But from a basketball perspective, when you just look at OG, Brunson, Randall plus another guy, or swapping out Randall for a guy, that starts to look like a really, really competitive team at the top of the Eastern Conference, which is about all you can hope for as a Knicks fan right now. So honestly, A+ is all around. I really like the move for both teams. You can, you know, have different disagreements about Toronto should have gotten draft capital instead of players and this and that, but I really think this is a deal that has worked out so far and should continue to do so as well. And it's just always nice when you have players that kind of change roles or change teams and go to a situation that's just going to be better for them long term, the way that it looks to be the case, at least in Toronto, for RJ Barrett and Immanuel Quickley. Because as much as on this channel we're rooting for chaos and content and just crazy things to happen, we also really, really want good basketball. And to have good basketball, we need good players, and good players need to be in good situations to continue to grow and develop. And I think we're going to have that in Toronto, and maybe we'll have that in New York with OG as well, with a potentially expanding offensive game. Regardless, absolutely love this trade. One of my favorites that we've had in recent years.